The valley had always felt like a world separate from everything else. It was a place where mornings were slow and gentle, where the sun rose softly behind the mountains and touched the fields with warm light. The people who lived there woke up each day with a quiet sense of gratitude. They believed their valley was a living spirit, a guardian that had protected them for generations. The forest, the river, the mountains, all of it felt like family. They lived in small wooden homes built by their ancestors. The walls were made from fallen trees, not cut ones, because they believed taking from the land was only allowed when nature offered something freely. Every home had a small place for prayer, where the families whispered their hopes and thanks each morning. Children grew up learning that the soil beneath their feet had a memory, and the wind carried the voices of those who lived before them. Life in the valley moved slowly. Days were filled with simple routines, collecting berries, gathering herbs, caring for animals that roamed freely, and listening to stories from the elders. The people never felt poor or lacking. They believed that as long as the valley stayed untouched by the outside world, they had everything they needed. They prayed not for wealth or power, but for peace and protection. They prayed that humans from beyond the mountains would never find them. The elders often told a story about the time before the valley was discovered by their ancestors. It was said that they had traveled for many days, looking for a safe place far from the noise and conflicts of other settlements. When they arrived at the valley, they felt something they had never felt before, a natural silence that calmed their hearts. The mountains on each side formed a natural shield, and the river that ran through the center brought fresh water all year. They believed it was a place chosen for them, a gift they were meant to protect. Generations later, that belief had not changed. People still treated the valley with deep respect. They avoided disturbing the forest too much. They spoke softly near the river, believing their voices should never rise louder than the sound of flowing water. Children were taught to thank the ground after picking a fruit or wildflower. It wasn't a rule forced on them. It was a simple way of life they naturally followed. Although the world outside was growing, the valley remained untouched. There were no roads, no power lines, no tall buildings. The people lived by sunlight during the day and warm firelight at night. They had heard stories from travelers long ago that the world beyond the mountains was changing quickly, cities rising, machines becoming louder, forests disappearing under concrete. These stories made the people feel uneasy. The idea of such noise and destruction entering their peaceful home was frightening. So every evening they gathered together for prayer. Some sat by the river, some near the large ancient tree at the center of the valley, and some simply outside their homes looking at the sky. Their prayer was always the same, that the outside world would never find their sanctuary. They didn't fear people themselves. They feared what people brought with them. They feared machines that did not rest, and decisions made only for profit. They feared losing what their ancestors had protected for centuries. The valley wasn't just land to them. It was the heart of their lives. Every path had a story. Every rock had a meaning. Every sound had a purpose. When the wind passed through the trees, the people listened closely, believing it carried messages. When animals moved in unusual patterns, the elders paid attention, thinking nature was trying to tell them something. Even though life there was quiet and simple, it was never dull. Each season offered something different. In spring, flowers covered the hills like colorful blankets. Children ran through the fields chasing butterflies, laughing freely. In summer, the river became their favorite place. Families gathered along the banks, cooling their hands and feet in the clear water. In autumn, leaves turned bright shades of orange and gold, and the valley felt like it was glowing. Winter brought cold winds, but also a peaceful stillness. Snow covered the mountains, and the valley seemed to sleep under a soft white layer. The people did not fear nature's changes. They embraced every season as part of the valley's rhythm. What they feared most was the one change they couldn't control: outsiders discovering their home. The elders often reminded the younger ones, as long as we respect the valley, it will protect us. But if humans from outside come, everything may change. The younger people sometimes wondered what the outside world looked like. They imagined tall buildings touching the sky and large roads stretching endlessly. They wondered what it felt like to see lights that did not come from fire, or to hear sounds that did not belong to animals or wind. But even in their curiosity, they carried the same hope as the elders, that these things would never reach their valley. There was a large rock formation on the northern side of the valley that the people considered sacred. From the top, one could see the entire land stretching below, the river winding like a ribbon, the small homes almost hidden under thick green trees, and the mountains standing like quiet guards around them. Many people climbed there to pray or to simply look at the beauty of their world. Standing there, anyone could feel why their ancestors chose this place to settle. It felt safe. It felt protected. It felt like home in the deepest sense. One particular evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the sky turned a warm orange. Families gathered near the river. They sat in small circles, talking softly, sharing food, and watching birds return to their nests. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that made them forget the existence of any world outside their valley. The river reflected the light of the fading sun, and the whole valley looked like a painting brought to life. On nights like that, their prayers felt even more important. They closed their eyes and spoke from their hearts, asking that their valley stay hidden, asking that the mountains continue to protect them, asking that humans from the outside world would never come. Their prayers were gentle, but filled with deep hope. Even animals seemed to sense the calmness of the night. Deer walked quietly along the river, and small birds perched on branches nearby, as if listening to the voices of the people. The entire valley seemed to breathe with them, sharing their peaceful moment. As darkness settled, the stars began to appear. The sky above the valley was always clear, unpolluted by any artificial light. The people believed that the stars were guides, watching over them. Children liked to lie on the grass and count them. Making wishes, they whispered to the sky. Everything about their life felt complete. They did not think about the world beyond. They did not imagine crowds or traffic or machines. They only knew their valley, their traditions, their harmony with nature. And for them, that was enough. But even in their deepest peace, a small fear lived quietly in the back of every mind. The world outside was growing faster than ever. People were searching for new lands, new resources, new opportunities. The valley had remained unnoticed for generations, but nothing stayed hidden forever. The elders sensed that time was changing. They prayed harder each day, hoping the valley's natural shield would continue to protect them. Little did they know, deep beyond the mountains, something had already shifted. A discovery had been made, a discovery that would test their prayers in ways they had never imagined. But for now, in those early moments before anything changed, the valley remained silent and safe, holding its people close like it always had. For many months, nothing unusual happened in the valley. Life moved at its usual slow pace. People woke up with the sunrise, followed their daily routines, and ended their evenings with quiet prayers. Birds chirped in the morning, the river whispered softly all day, and the mountains stood tall like they always had. Everything felt normal, until one morning when the air carried something strange. It began as a light tremble in the ground. At first, most people thought it was just the mountains stretching, the way it sometimes did after cold nights. But this time, the vibration lasted longer. Cups on wooden tables shook slightly. A few hanging tools clattered. Animals lifted their heads and looked around, confused. Even the birds stopped singing for a moment, as if they were listening to something humans couldn't hear. A few villagers stepped outside their homes. trying to understand what was happening. The sky looked normal. The river flowed the same as always. Nothing looked different, yet something felt wrong. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, but they said nothing yet. They preferred to watch and wait before alarming everyone. As the day went on, the vibration faded, and the valley returned to its calm self. But the feeling of uneasiness stayed. That night, many people prayed a little longer than usual, whispering quietly to the spirits of their land, asking for protection and clarity. The next morning, something new appeared. Near the eastern ridge of the valley, small colored flags were sticking out of the ground. They were planted in neat lines, each one fluttering in the wind. No one in the valley had placed them there. The cloth felt strange, the colors too bright, and the sticks too smooth. The villagers gathered around the ridge, staring at the flags with growing confusion. They had never seen anything like this. The elders recognized what they meant. Many years ago, a traveler had passed through the valley and told them how people in distant lands used such flags to mark places where they wanted to build roads, buildings, or mine the ground. The traveler had described these flags as warnings, early signs that outsiders were planning something. The elders stood silently, their hearts sinking. They knew exactly what these small pieces of cloth meant, and none of it was good. Some of the younger villagers did not understand the seriousness and asked questions. Why would someone put these here? They wondered aloud. Is it a mistake? Will they come back for them? But the elders knew there was no mistake. Outsiders had discovered the valley. That evening, the elders called everyone together. They stood in a circle around a small fire, and the flames flickered across their worried faces. One of the oldest elders spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. These flags, he said, come from the outside world. They mean someone is planning to return. And they will not come alone. They will bring machines, noise, and changes we never wished for. A heavy silence fell over the group. Many people lowered their heads. Some looked toward the mountains, as if hoping they would somehow shield them again. The thought of outsiders entering their valley, digging into their land, or cutting trees filled them with fear. They had prayed for generations that such a day would never come. But their prayers, for the first time, seemed unanswered. Despite the fear, the villagers tried to stay calm. The elders reminded them that panic would not help. Instead, they encouraged everyone to be watchful and keep their routines as normal as possible. We must not let fear guide our hearts, one elder said. The valley has protected us for generations. We must trust it a little longer. The next few days were filled with both tension and curiosity. People kept checking the eastern ridge, hoping the flags might mysteriously disappear the same way they appeared. But they didn't. Instead, more signs began to show. One afternoon, a strange low sound echoed through the valley. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't wind or thunder or anything the villagers recognized. It was deep and mechanical, like a faraway growl that never stopped. Children covered their ears, and dogs barked nervously. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but it left everyone unsettled. Later that week, the sky above the eastern ridge filled with dust. Birds flew away from that direction, flapping their wings in chaotic patterns. Deer and other animals ran down from the hills, something they never did unless they were frightened by a serious disturbance. The villagers gathered once again at the ridge and saw fresh marks in the soil tracks they had never seen before. Deep, wide, harsh lines cut across the land, leading toward the flags. The ground looked wounded. By now, there was no doubt left. Outsiders were close. That night, the villagers prayed with more urgency than ever. They prayed for the spirits to hide the valley again, to make the outsiders turn back, to keep their home safe. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath with them. The air felt heavy, the night quiet. The next morning, Everything changed. As the sun rose, the villagers heard it again, this time louder, clearer, and closer. The mechanical growl was no longer distant. The earth vibrated beneath their feet in a steady rhythm. It wasn't a natural vibration. It was the movement of machines. A group of villagers quickly climbed to a high point near the ridge. What they saw made their hearts drop. Large metal machines were slowly making their way toward the valley. Their wheels crushed everything under them, small bushes, dry branches, patches of flowers. Behind them, humans walked with helmets, maps, and equipment the villagers had never seen before. These people looked confident, determined, unaware of the valley they were disturbing. The villagers watched from a hidden spot, silent and shocked. None of them had ever seen such machines. The outsiders pointed at the land, took notes, and placed more flags. They didn't look around to appreciate the beauty. They didn't pause to understand the place. They acted as if the valley was an empty piece of land waiting to be taken. The villagers returned home with heavy hearts. They knew this was no longer a small disturbance. It was the beginning of something big, something that could change their entire world. The elders gathered once more and tried to think of what could be done. Some believed they should confront the outsiders and explain the sacredness of the land. Others feared that doing so might attract even more attention. A few suggested that they simply continue praying and trust nature to protect them. But the machines were still moving, and prayers alone didn't seem enough this time. The next days were filled with tension. People stayed close to their homes, whispering in worries. Daily routines felt different. Even the animals behaved strangely less playful, more alert. Birds flew in unusual patterns, and rabbits kept hiding in burrows longer than usual. It was as if nature itself knew that something dangerous was coming. One morning, the machines paused near the edge of the forest. The villagers watched from afar as the outsiders studied the land, talking and pointing. They placed markers around trees and hammered stakes into the ground. The villagers didn't understand their words, but they could sense that the outsiders were planning something. The valley's peaceful silence was gone. The familiar sounds of nature were now mixed with the unfamiliar hum of machines and human chatter. The villagers felt trapped between fear and helplessness. For the first time, they couldn't imagine what tomorrow might bring. Even the elders struggled to stay calm. They knew that once the outside world stepped inside the valley, things would never be the same again. Every night, the villagers gathered to pray, their voices filled with more worry than hope. They asked the spirits to protect the land, to hide it once again, to turn the outsiders away. They prayed for peace, for safety, for the valley's survival. But deep in their hearts, they knew their prayers might not be enough this time. The outsiders had found their home, and they were not leaving. The sun had only just risen when the noise returned louder than before, closer than ever. The people of the valley stepped outside their homes with heavy hearts. The sound rolled through the valley like a deep metallic roar that refused to stop. It shook the stillness they had always known, replacing the natural songs of birds and wind with a harsh, unnatural rhythm. The machines were now at the valley's entrance. They stood tall and heavy, their metal bodies shining in the morning light. Their engines rumbled nonstop, vibrating the ground beneath them. The quiet life the villagers had always lived was no longer the same. Even the river, which usually whispered softly, seemed to sound different because of the noise surrounding it. A group of villagers climbed the ridge once again to see the outsiders more clearly. What they saw made their hearts sink deeper. The outsiders had set up equipment, tents, and large boxes near the edge of the valley. Some were studying maps, some were measuring distances, and others were walking around with tools the villagers had never seen. Every movement showed that the outsiders were not just passing through. They were preparing to change things. The villagers hid behind trees and rocks, watching silently. None of them moved. Even their breathing felt heavy, as if the weight of the moment pressed upon their chests. The machines had begun clearing small patches of land. Sharp metal arms dug into the ground, tearing out roots, bushes, and soil. The earth that had always been treated with love was being ripped apart in seconds. One villager whispered, "They don't see the valley the way we do." Another said, "They think it's empty land." And that was the hardest truth. To the outsiders, the valley looked untouched, unexplored, and ready to be taken. They didn't know the stories behind every tree. They didn't see the sacred spots where generations had prayed. They didn't feel the connection between the people and their home to them. The valley was simply land that could be used by the afternoon. The sound of cutting tools and engines filled the air. The outsiders didn't seem to hear the despair of the villagers or the frightened cries of the animals. Birds flew farther into the valley, searching for safer places. Deer stayed hidden. Even the river fish moved deeper into the water, disturbed by the constant vibrations. The villagers gathered in the center of the valley, near the ancient tree where they often met. The elders stood before them, faces marked with worry. One of the elders spoke gently but firmly. "We have lived in peace with this land our entire lives. We have asked for protection. We have prayed. But now the valley is calling us to act. We must do something, or everything we love may be lost." The younger villagers nodded, though fear still lingered in their eyes. Many had never faced a threat like this. They had grown up believing the valley would always shield them. They never imagined a day when metal machines would break through its borders. Some suggested meeting the outsiders and explaining the importance of the valley. Others feared that doing so might make things worse. "If they know we are here," one villager said, "they may bring even more people." The elders listened carefully. They did not want to choose a path blindly by the end of the meeting. They agreed to stay hidden a little longer until they understood what the outsiders truly wanted. But deep down, they sensed the outsiders' intentions were not gentle. That night, the noise from the machines didn't stop. It echoed through the valley long after dark. People tried to sleep, but the unnatural sound followed them, seeping into their homes, their dreams, their hearts. Children clung to their families, unable to rest. Even the animals stayed awake, pacing or hiding. The next morning, the villagers discovered something even more alarming. Several outsiders had already walked deeper into the valley. They carried tools that hummed and beeped. They pointed at rocks, plants, and soil samples. They spoke in a language the villagers couldn't fully understand, but the tone was clear, excited, confident, and completely unaware of the fear they were causing. The outsiders placed new flags around the valley's entrance, then along the riverbank, and even near the base of the ancient tree. These flags were different from the first ones. They were brighter, sturdier, and spaced closer together. They marked the beginning of something serious. One elder whispered, "They are mapping the land." Another responded, "They are planning to build." The thought sent shivers through everyone. They imagined their beloved valley being torn apart by roads, heavy machines, or perhaps even mines. The idea was unbearable. Later that afternoon, the villagers watched as a small group of outsiders set up a long metal device on the ridge. It made a sharp, pulsing sound every few seconds. Each pulse echoed across the valley, bouncing off the mountains, disturbing everything. Birds took flight repeatedly, unable to settle. The villagers had no idea what the device did, but they knew it wasn't meant for anything peaceful. Some villagers could no longer hold back their tears. Others clenched their fists, feeling a mixture of fear and helpless anger. The peace they had always known was slipping away like water between their fingers. The elders met again, this time under the ancient tree. They tried to speak calmly, but their voices carried worry. "We can no longer hope this will stop on its own," one elder said quietly. The outsiders are here with a purpose. They will not turn back unless something makes them. Another elder added, "Our prayers have carried us through many storms, but this is something different. The valley is suffering. We cannot stand still." The villagers knew the elders were right. But what could they do against machines that were stronger than anything they had ever seen? Against people who carried equipment, tools, and papers filled with plans? For a moment, silence filled the meeting. Each person stared at the ground, thinking hard. Then a younger villager spoke softly. "We may not be able to stop their machines, but we can make them notice us. They do not see this valley as a home. They don't know people live here. Maybe if they realize, they will understand." The elders understood the hope behind the words, but they also saw the risk. Approaching the outsiders could bring attention that might bring even more outsiders, more machines, more danger. But doing nothing meant allowing the valley to be destroyed. They debated for hours. Some argued that hiding was safer. Others insisted that silence would only lead to greater harm. In the end, they reached a difficult decision. A small group would try to observe the outsiders more closely and look for the right moment to reveal themselves peacefully. They would choose the moment carefully. They would not rush. They would be calm, respectful, and cautious. This valley had always believed in harmony, and the villagers wanted to honor that belief even in this difficult moment. That night, the valley felt restless. The machines glowed with harsh lights, and the outsiders stayed awake late, studying maps and papers. The villagers sat by their fires, speaking softly, worrying deeply, but trying to find strength in one another. The river, too, seemed to move faster than usual, as if sensing the tension. Even the mountains, which always stood firm and calm, appeared darker against the night sky. The stars were still bright, but the peaceful feeling they usually brought was overshadowed by uncertainty. The next morning, things grew even more alarming. The machines had moved further inside the valley. One heavy machine had begun scraping the ground near the river, pushing soil aside to create a flat path. Another machine was digging near the ridge, sending up clouds of dust. Outsiders walked confidently, pointing and marking new locations. It was happening so fast. Too fast. Everything the villagers feared was becoming real. Their prayers, their hopes, their traditions, they all felt fragile now in the face of metal and noise. One villager said, "If this continues, our valley will never be the same." Another replied, "It already isn't." The elders stood watching quietly, their hearts full of pain. The valley they had protected for generations was now trembling under the weight of machines that did not belong. It was clear to everyone. Their peaceful world had changed forever, and unless they found a way to act, the outsiders would soon take more than just space. They would take the very soul of the valley. The valley was no longer the quiet home the villagers once knew. Every morning began with the noise of machines instead of birds. Even before the sun touched the mountains, the outsiders' engines were already running. The soft sound of the river was lost under the heavy growls of metal. The villagers felt as if the valley itself was crying, but they could not comfort it. For days, they watched from a distance, hoping for a miracle, hoping the outsiders would lose interest and leave. But each day the machines moved deeper, clearing more land and placing more flags. The ground that once held wildflowers now held deep tire marks. Trees that once stood proudly now leaned or lay on the ground after being pushed aside. The villagers felt powerless, but they also knew they could not stand back forever. The elders gathered everyone near the river one evening. The air was cool, but the worry in their hearts made the night feel heavy. One elder spoke softly. "We cannot chase the outsiders away with anger. That is not who we are. But we cannot allow them to destroy everything either. The valley needs us now. It has cared for us all these years now. It is our turn to care for it." The villagers nodded, though fear still rested in their eyes. They had never fought anyone, never argued with strangers. Their lives had always been peaceful. But now they had no choice but to step forward. They decided to take small steps. A few brave villagers went to the ridge at dawn to watch the outsiders closely, not with anger, but with curiosity. They wanted to understand what the outsiders planned to do. They hid behind rocks and tall grass, careful not to be seen. From this distance, they could hear discussions words like road, site, samples, and approval. They didn't understand everything. But one thing became clear. The outsiders thought the valley was unoccupied land. They had no idea a community lived here. They had no idea how much history lived in every tree and every path. That afternoon, the villagers decided it was time to make their presence known, but gently. They did not want to start conflict. Instead, they would try to speak to the outsiders in a calm, peaceful way. They believed that once the outsiders saw real people living here, they might reconsider their plans. A small group of villagers walked toward the ridge, holding white cloths as a sign of peace. Their hearts pounded with fear, but they moved forward. Remembering the elders' words, "The valley needs us," they approached slowly, making sure their steps were visible so they wouldn't scare anyone. When the outsiders finally noticed them, they stopped working and stared in surprise. The villagers paused too, unsure of how the outsiders would react. For a moment, there was complete silence. No machine noise, no wind, no movement. One villager stepped forward, placing a hand over their heart, trying to show respect and goodwill. The outsiders exchanged looks, whispering among themselves. Then one of them tried to speak, but the villagers couldn't understand the language fully. Still, the tone seemed neutral, not aggressive. This gave the villagers a little courage. They began explaining in simple gestures and a few known words that this valley was their home, that they had lived here peacefully for generations, that the land was sacred to them. They pointed to the mountains, the river, the forest, trying to show how deeply connected they were to this place. The outsiders looked confused. It was clear they hadn't expected to find people living here. They checked their maps and whispered to each other again. One outsider tried to communicate by pointing at the ground, showing documents and drawing shapes. It seemed they were trying to explain they had permission to build something. But the villagers didn't understand the value of papers or permits. To them, the land itself was the only authority. The meeting ended without understanding. The villagers walked back home slowly, their hearts heavy. They had tried to communicate, but the outsiders seemed more interested in their papers than in people. That night, the entire valley gathered once again. The villagers explained what happened. The elders listened carefully. They knew the outsiders would not leave simply because a few villagers told them the valley was their home. The outsiders believed in maps and documents. They might not understand the connection the villagers had with the land, but the elders were not ready to give up. They decided to reach out to people beyond the valley people who understood both worlds. Many years ago, a few travelers had visited the valley and promised to help if the villagers ever needed support. The elders remembered this. They believed there were people outside who cared about nature, about preserving untouched places, about protecting communities. The villagers sent a small group through a hidden mountain path, following directions from long ago. They carried small bags of dried food and water, ready for the long journey. They walked quietly, knowing the land needed them to act now. Back in the valley, the outsiders continued their work. The machines grew louder. They set up more tents and brought larger equipment. The villagers watched helplessly as parts of the forest were marked for clearing. Each mark felt like a wound in their hearts. The animals suffered too. Birds flew farther away, confused by the noise. Squirrels avoided trees near the ridge. Even the river fish seemed restless. The villagers noticed that fewer deer appeared in the mornings. Nature itself was trembling under the disruption. One morning, a group of villagers walked toward the ridge, not to hide, but to stand quietly in front of the machines. They did not yell or demand anything. They simply stood there with calm faces, their presence speaking louder than any words. They stood with hands by their sides, feet firmly planted, showing they were not afraid. The outsiders grew frustrated. They tried to talk, to signal the villagers to move, but the villagers stayed where they were. The machines couldn't move forward without harming them. So they shut down temporarily, for the first time in many days. The valley heard silence again. It was brief, but it gave the villagers a small sense of hope. Maybe peaceful resistance could slow the outsiders down. Maybe it would buy enough time for the group who had left the valley to bring help. The villagers held on to this hope like a fragile seed. Days passed. The outsiders started taking photos, recording videos, and writing notes. The villagers didn't know what any of it meant, but they sensed pressure building. The outsiders were trying to prove something to their bosses, to their company, maybe even to the government, but the villagers continued their peaceful presence. Every morning, they stood along the ridge, forming a quiet line between the outsiders and the deeper parts of the valley. They didn't shout or threaten. Their silence was their strength. It was their way of showing that the valley was not empty land. It was a home. Slowly, a few outsiders began to look uncertain. They whispered to one another. Some seemed uncomfortable continuing their work while the villagers stood there, watching with calm, steady eyes. Even the loudest machines sometimes paused, as if unsure. One outsider approached the villagers again, this time gently. They spoke slowly, using hand signals and pointing to show they understood the villagers lived here. The villager at the front nodded but kept their stance firm. They pointed back toward the deeper valley, toward their homes, their families, their sacred places. They hoped that even if the outsiders didn't understand every word, they would understand the meaning. That evening, the outsiders had a long discussion among themselves. They looked troubled, flipping through their papers, pointing at maps, and shaking their heads. Something was changing, but the villagers didn't know what. Days later, the group that had traveled beyond the valley finally returned, tired, hungry, but with news. They had found people willing to help, environmental groups, journalists, and individuals who cared about protecting untouched land. These people promised to come and support the villagers. This news filled the valley with new energy. The villagers felt hope growing like sunrise after a long night. They were not alone anymore. The valley was no longer a silent place waiting to be taken. It had voices, now many voices. The fight for their home had truly begun. When the final court decision came, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. The people had spent months fighting for their land, and even though they were tired, they stood together as the message spread from one house to another. The long struggle had changed everyone. Some had grown more serious, some more hopeful, and some more cautious. But they all shared the same feeling, that whatever the result was, their valley would never again be the same as before the day the first survey flags appeared. When the announcement finally reached them, it didn't feel like a celebration at first. It was more like a long sigh, a release of tension that had been building for too long. The authorities had agreed to stop the biggest part of the construction. The mining company was forced to limit its operations and leave a large area untouched. The valley would be protected by law. It wasn't a perfect victory, and everyone knew they had lost some parts of the land forever. But they had saved most of it, and that meant something precious. As the news spread across the valley, some people cried quietly. They weren't tears of sadness or joy, just emotion that had no single name. The older people looked at the mountains with a kind of gratitude, whispering that the spirits of the land had stood with them. The younger ones, who had spent days traveling to meet reporters and activists, felt proud that their efforts had not been wasted. Families came out of their homes and stood outside in the sunlight, talking softly to one another. For the first time in months, the sound of heavy machines did not interrupt their conversations. In the following weeks, the company removed the loudest equipment. The strange metal structures that had looked so out of place in the valley were taken down. Workers packed up their tools and left. The people watched them go with mixed feelings. Some felt relief, others felt bitterness. Many had wished these outsiders had never come at all. But now that the fight was finally coming to an end, the community turned its attention to what needed to be repaired. Though a large part of the valley was saved, some areas had already been disturbed. The once silent forest paths had tire marks. Some trees had been cut or damaged. Patches of earth had been turned over, leaving empty spaces where plants once grew. The people did not ignore these scars. They walked through the damaged zone slowly, almost as if they were visiting an injured friend. They began to clean and restore what they could. The younger villagers brought tools to clear away leftover debris. The older ones collected seeds from healthy areas of the forest and planted them where the soil was bare. Children helped by carrying small baskets of seedlings. Everyone worked together, not out of anger, but out of love for the land that had given them a home. During these days, stories were shared everywhere at mealtimes, around fires, while planting trees, or while resting in the shade. People talked about what they had gone through. They remembered the first day they heard the sounds of machines. They remembered the fear they felt when the officials ignored their warnings. They also remembered the day the valley's story reached the outside world, and how strangers from faraway cities came to support them. For the first time, they realized they were not as alone as they had always believed. Yes, they had wanted to stay hidden, and yes, they had prayed for humans to stay away. But when the danger became too great, it was also humans, people who cared about nature, who helped them protect their home. That thought stayed with them. It changed the way they saw the world outside their valley. Slowly, life returned to something closer to normal. The mornings became peaceful again. Birds returned to areas they had avoided. The nights were filled with the soft sounds of insects instead of distant engines. Families began fishing again, collecting herbs, and tending to their small farms. People who had spent months talking to lawyers and reporters now found themselves rebuilding fences or repairing roofs. But even as life settled, the experience had left a permanent mark on the community. The fight had forced them to step into the open for the first time. They had appeared in news reports, spoken at meetings, and formed connections with environmental groups. They had discovered that their voices matter, even if they lived in a small valley hidden from most maps. And once a voice learns to be heard, it cannot easily go silent again. Some members of the community began to plan how to protect the valley in the long term. They talked about setting up educational programs to teach visitors about the land's importance. They discussed forming a local council to keep watch over any future developments. They wanted to make sure that no one could quietly threaten their home again. Their goal wasn't to shut the world out forever. They simply wanted to ensure that whoever came in the future would understand the value of the land instead of trying to take from it. On one quiet evening, the community gathered near the river, a place they had always considered sacred. The sound of flowing water echoed gently across the smooth stones. People sat in small groups, watching the light fade over the mountains. The air was calm, and a sense of peace settled over them. It wasn't the same peace they had before the intruders came. This one was different. It was the peace that comes after hardship, the kind that comes from knowing you fought for something and refused to give up. One of the elders stood and looked around at the water, the trees, and the people who had stood together through everything. He spoke softly, reminding them that the valley had survived because they chose to protect it. He reminded them that their ancestors had trusted them to guard the land, and they had honored that responsibility. His voice was calm but strong, and everyone listened carefully, absorbing the meaning of his words. In the days that followed, something beautiful began to happen. The valley started to feel alive again. Plants that had been disturbed began to grow. Birds nested in places that had been silent during the construction period. People found new energy to rebuild and plant more gardens. Even the air seemed fresher, as though the valley itself was trying to heal. Visitors began to arrive, not the kind who came with machines and maps, but people who traveled with respect, curious to learn about the valley's culture and history. The community welcomed them cautiously but kindly. They guided them through the safe areas, explained the importance of the land, and shared stories of the fight to protect it. The visitors listened with genuine interest, promising to spread the story so others would understand why. Nature must be protected. This sharing created a new connection between the valley and the world. And strangely, this time, the community didn't fear it. They realized something important. The best way to protect a place is not to hide it forever, but to help people understand why it matters. Many people destroy nature not because they hate it, but because they never learned to value it. So the valley became a symbol. People who had never heard of it before spoke about it in schools, in news articles, and in social gatherings. Environmental groups used the valley's story as an example of what can happen when a community stands up to protect its home. Little by little, the world learned about the hidden valley where people prayed humans would never come, and how those prayers were ignored. But the people still found a way to defend their land. Years passed, and the story continued to be told. Children who had personally seen the conflict grew up and shared their memories with younger ones. They explained why protecting nature was one of the greatest responsibilities a person could have. Their words carried weight because they had lived through something real, something that had shaped them forever. The valley changed, but it remained beautiful. The scars left by the machines faded slowly as plants grew back and the soil healed. The community continued to watch over their home with care, and they promised themselves that they would never again allow anyone to threaten it without resistance. Even though the humans they had feared did come, even though their prayers went unheard, they realized that their power did not lie in being hidden. Their power lay in their unity, their courage, and their deep connection to the land. And because of that strength, the valley still stood. The world came to know their story, not as a tragedy, but as an example of determination. And the people themselves learned something even more important, that sometimes, even when prayers go unanswered, standing together can create a new kind of hope, one that grows stronger with time.